You know, F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. It's one of those absolute giants of American literature. But for decades, it's had this reputation, haunted by one word, unfilmable. So when Baz Luhrmann, a director who is an absolute master of spectacle, decided to give it a shot back in 2013, the result was, well, it was cinematic dynamite. The big question is, how did he even try to solve the impossible problem of taking a book that really lives inside your head and splashing it onto the big screen? Let's break it down. I mean, that single line, it gets right to the absolute heart of Jay Gatsby, doesn't it? It's not about his actions, not really. It's about the idea of him. See, Fitzgerald's prose, that beautiful language, that's the soul of the book. And capturing that poetic feeling is exactly what makes it so incredibly tough to translate into a purely visual medium like film. And that really brings us to the core question here. How do you turn that into images? How do you adapt a book that's famous not really for its plot, but for its mood, its voice, its perfect lyrical language? This was the monumental, some would say impossible challenge Luhrmann set for himself. All right, Section 1, an unfilmable book, and the problem with perfect prose. So what really makes it unfilmable? Well, here's the thing. The novel's real story, it all happens inside the head of the narrator, Nick Carraway. It's his judgments, his melancholy, his absolute fascination with Gatsby. That's the soul of the book. If you take all that away, you're just left with a pretty straightforward melodrama. The genius is all in the telling, not just the tale itself. Believe it or not, there's actually a super academic term for this exact challenge. It's called intersemiotic translation. Now, that's really just a fancy way of saying you have to move meaning from one system, like written words, to a totally different one, like moving images and sound. You have to change the form, but you can't lose the soul of the original. And let me tell you, Luhrmann's solutions, they were nothing if not bold. Okay, on to part 2, making the voice visual. And the first solution is all about rebuilding the narrator. So Luhrmann's first big swing was to tackle this problem of Nick's voice head-on. I mean, if the narration is the most important part of the book, you can't just have a character talking at the audience for 2 hours straight. It just doesn't work. You've got to give him a real reason to be telling this story. And Luhrmann's solution was to invent a whole new framing device. In the movie, Nick isn't just looking back from somewhere in the Midwest. Oh no, he's a patient in a sanitarium, writing the story down as a form of therapy. Now, this is a huge change. It gives his narration a very concrete purpose, for sure, but it also fundamentally changes him. In the novel, Nick is our moral bedrock, our compass. In the film, well, now he's a potentially unreliable narrator. This choice forces us to ask a really crucial question. When Nick delivers that famous line, "You're worth the whole damn bunch put together," is that a clear-eyed moral judgment? Or is it the desperate projection of a broken man, a man who just desperately needs a hero to believe in? The film really leans into that ambiguity, and it changes everything. But you know, changing the narrator wasn't his only trick for getting that voice on screen. To get Fitzgerald's actual beautiful prose into the movie, Luhrmann tried something else, something he called a cinematic poem. And what that means is he literally made the words themselves a part of the scenery. You see it all through the movie, right? Words are floating in the air, they dissolve like dust in the Valley of Ashes. They even pop out at you in 3D. And look, while this is a very direct, very loving homage to the book's language, a lot of critics argued it just breaks the immersion. Instead of getting lost in the story, you're constantly being reminded that you're watching a movie about a famous book. It kind of keeps that tragic reality at a distance. Okay, Section 3, hearing the jazz age. This is about translating the vibe. And this brings us to, well, maybe the most controversial choice in the entire film, the music. Luhrmann's second big solution wasn't about translating the words anymore, it was about translating the entire vibe of the 1920s for a modern audience, one that's almost a century removed from that world. His logic here relies on this really fascinating idea called fidelity to the energy. Basically, it means that you shouldn't be faithful to the literal historical details. Instead, you should be faithful to the original feeling, the cultural impact that those details had at the time. I mean, just think about it for a second. Back in the 1920s, jazz wasn't this nice, nostalgic music you hear in a coffee shop. No way. It was rebellious. It was dangerous. It was seen as morally questionable. To our modern ears, a lot of that music can sound, well, kind of quaint and safe. So a totally historically accurate soundtrack might have completely failed to land that visceral, subversive shock of the jazz age. So Luhrmann performs this really brilliant act of translation. He asked himself a series of questions. Step 1. What was the cultural function of jazz back then?
Okay, it was rebellious, dangerous, the sound of the underground. Step 2, what's a modern equivalent? What music held a similar cultural position? Well, for a long time, that was hip-hop. And so, step 3, he brings in Jay-Z. This wasn't just a gimmick to sell soundtracks. It was a calculated move to make us feel the shock, the energy, the disruptive hedonism of Gatsby's parties in the exact same way a reader back in 1925 would have.
All right, next up, the romantic versus the criminal. This is all about streamlining the characters. And this whole focus on feeling over fact, it doesn't just apply to the music. It extends to the characters too. The film's third major change is to simplify the key players, to really laser focus the story on this grand, tragic romance, even if it meant losing some of the novel's really sharp, biting social critique. See, in the novel, Gatsby is just this walking contradiction. He is part romantic idealist, a guy with an incredible, unbelievable gift for hope, but at the same time, he is part common criminal, a bootlegger, a bond fraudster, a pretty ruthless guy. He's both of these things at once. The film, though, it systematically sands down all of Gatsby's rougher criminal edges. For example, it completely omits his father, Henry Gatz, who shows up at the end of the book and reminds us of his humble, very human origins. Gone. It also omits Daisy's daughter, Pammy, a living, breathing obstacle to the romance. Gone. And it omits the final damning proof of Gatsby's bond fraud that comes out after his death. All of these cuts, all these omissions, they all serve one primary purpose: to make Gatsby a more pure, more straightforward romantic hero. So this makes you wonder, right? In turning Gatsby into this kind of martyr for love, did the film sacrifice the book's much deeper, much darker social critique? Because the novel suggests Gatsby's dream is corrupt not just because Daisy might be unworthy of it, but because the dream itself, a dream built on crime and the idea of possessing another person, is completely rotten from the very start. So, Section 5, faithful or a betrayal. Let's talk about this spectacle of fidelity. Where does all this leave us? Is Baz Luhrmann's film a faithful adaptation, or is it just a spectacular betrayal? Well, the fascinating truth is it's both, often in the very same moment. It's a spectacle built on this wild mix of intense, word-for-word loyalty and incredibly radical reinvention. And this table really lays out all the trade-offs perfectly. You've got the frame narrative. The book is ambiguous. The film uses the sanitarium, which pathologizes Nick. The soundtrack. The novel has period jazz. The film uses hip-hop to translate the energy. Gatsby's father, present in the book to humanize him, omitted in the film to elevate him to a myth. Same with Daisy's daughter. Her presence shatters the fantasy in the book, but she's omitted to simplify the romance in the film. Even the big confrontation in the Plaza Hotel. It's a verbal showdown in the book, but a physical outburst in the film to externalize that internal crisis. Every single one of these changes is a deliberate choice with a very real consequence. So when it comes right down to it, Luhrmann's film really prioritizes the feeling of Gatsby's obsession over the subtle sociology of Fitzgerald's prose. He made a choice. He sacrificed the novel's quiet, devastating social critique for something loud, spectacular, and just emotionally overwhelming. And in the end, the film becomes a spectacle of what you could call moral rubberiness, just this blinding hope projected in 3D against the green light of a post-crisis world. It reflects its own time just as much as the book reflected the Jazz Age. I mean, it was released not long after the 2008 financial crisis. It's a story about blinding hope and dirty money, shown to an audience that knew all too well how that kind of story tends to end. And all of this leaves us with one final big question. What does it actually mean to be faithful to a piece of art? Is the most faithful adaptation the one that copies the source perfectly, preserving it like a pristine museum piece? Or is it the one that radically transforms it, the one that breaks it apart and rebuilds it so that it can shock and move and feel just as alive for a new generation as the original did all those years ago?